The courthouse was a building that seemed to breathe authority. Its walls were paneled with dark oak, polished to the point that the reflection of the chandeliers glittered faintly against them. High ceilings arched above the packed chamber, casting long shadows over the jurors, who sat rigidly in their chairs. The benches creaked every time a spectator shifted, though few dared to move at all. It wasn't just another day in court. It was the kind of trial that had drawn journalists, activists, and off-duty officers to watch history unfold. At the center of it all sat the judge, an older man with a stern, weathered face and deep lines carved by years of presiding over battles of truth and lies. His gavel rested near his hand, not for decoration, but as a constant reminder that chaos could be cut short at his command. Today, however, even he looked uneasy. There was something charged in the air, as if everyone in that room understood the stakes were higher than anyone dared to admit. Aloud. The trial itself was not new to headlines. Allegations of police misconduct had been buzzing for months, and this hearing was supposed to bring clarity, or at least resolution. But clarity was elusive. Witnesses contradicted themselves, lawyers turned every sentence into a weapon, and the jury seemed caught in a tug-of-war between duty and doubt. The prosecution painted a picture of noble officers defending law and order. The defense countered with allegations of cover-ups, intimidation, and broken trust. And then there was the police dog. The canine sat at the front, leashed to his handler, his posture as disciplined as a soldier at attention. He was a German shepherd, sleek and imposing, his fur a blend of rich tan and black that shimmered under the courtroom's lights. His ears pricked at every sudden sound, his amber eyes scanning the room with the quiet intelligence of an animal trained, not just to obey, but to sense danger. Some jurors avoided looking at him entirely, perhaps unsettled by the calm, watchful gaze. Others stared as if the animal itself were part of the testimony, silent, yet powerful. The handler, a tall officer in his late 30s, shifted slightly in his seat. He was dressed in uniform, the badges and insignias catching the glow from above. He looked composed, but his grip on the dog's leash was firm, almost too firm, as though he feared what might happen if he relaxed for even a moment. It wasn't just about control. It was about what the dog represented. In a courtroom built on words and evidence, this canine stood as a living embodiment of loyalty, law, and unflinching duty. Spectators filled the wooden benches, their faces a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Some whispered quietly to one another before the bailiff's glare silenced them. Reporters scratched furiously in their notebooks, the scratching of pens nearly drowned out by the hum of the overhead lights. The mother and her toddler, tucked quietly in the back row, hardly drew notice at first. All eyes were on the attorneys. On the left, the prosecution's lead attorney adjusted his tie and stepped forward with a practiced air of confidence. His voice rang out, smooth but firm, as he questioned a witness about police protocols. He carried himself like a man who believed the law was on his side, every word deliberate, every pause calculated to guide the jury exactly where he wanted them. His questions built like bricks in a wall, one fact stacked upon another until his narrative seemed unshakable. On the opposite side, the defense attorney sat with arms crossed, his gaze sharp, his mind constantly calculating. He waited for the right moment, ready to spring forward with objections that sliced through the prosecution's flow. When he finally rose, his voice was sharp, precise and biting, unraveling each carefully laid brick with surgical precision. The back and forth was relentless, like two fencers locked in combat, each strike countered by an equally deft parry. The jurors shifted under the weight of it all. Some scribbled notes, others leaned forward, trying to follow every detail. A few exchanged uncertain glances, the complexity of the case threatening to overwhelm them. This wasn't just about facts anymore, it was about trust. Who could they believe? the officers sworn to protect them, or the citizens claiming to have been wronged. The tension in the room grew with each passing minute. It was palpable, thick, like humidity before a storm. Every creak of the floorboards seemed louder than it should be. Every cough drew irritated stares. Even the judge's breathing, slow and deliberate, felt amplified in the silence between exchanges. And still, the dog sat out. His presence was steady, grounding, yet unnerving. Every so often, his gaze shifted, his eyes fixing momentarily on a juror or a spectator before returning to stillness. To some, it was reassuring, a reminder of the discipline and loyalty trained into him. To others, it was unsettling, a reminder that in this courtroom, not everything was under human control. The handler's jaw tightened as he caught the defense attorney glancing at the dog, as though considering him not as a companion, but as a piece of evidence yet to be examined. He hated that look. To him, the animal was not a prop in a legal drama, but a partner who had saved lives. Yet he knew appearances mattered, and in this trial, appearances were everything. The clock ticked past noon. Sunlight streamed in through the tall windows, dust motes drifting lazily in the beams. The heat of so many bodies crammed into one room made the air heavy, almost oppressive. Still, no one dared leave. The story unfolding here was too important, too unpredictable, and every person in that chamber felt they were on the edge of witnessing something extraordinary. The judge shifted in his seat, tapping the gavel lightly against the block, not to silence anyone, but as though to remind himself of his authority. His eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on the canine, then the handler, then the attorneys. He knew he was presiding over more than a trial. He was presiding over a battle for public trust, one that extended far beyond these walls. The defense attorney rose again, his tone sharper now, challenging inconsistencies in a witness's statement. The prosecution objected, the judge sustained, and the rhythm of the duel continued. Every word carried weight, every slip of the tongue magnified under the scrutiny of those present. And still, in the back row, a toddler wriggled in his mother's arms. The child's presence was almost invisible against the tide of legal arguments and formal proceedings. Most assumed he would grow bored and restless, that he was too young to understand anything of what was happening. But his eyes never left the front of the room. He stared not at the lawyers, not at the judge, but at the police dog, watchful, unblinking, as if he recognized something no one else could see. The courtroom, in all its formality, was not prepared for innocence to pierce through its carefully constructed walls. Not yet, for now, it remained what it had been since the trial began, a place of tension, of clashing narratives, of uncertain truth. Yet beneath the polished surface, something stirred a current no one could see, but everyone could feel. The air was too heavy, the silences too sharp, the gazes too fixed. It was as though the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for something, though none could name what it was. When it came, it would shatter the order of things. But for the moment, the courtroom held steady. A stage set for revelation, every player in their place, unaware that the smallest spectator was about to become the most significant voice in the room. The back row of the courtroom was never meant to hold much significance. It was where observers sat quietly, blending into the polished oak surroundings, far removed from the heated exchanges between attorneys and witnesses. Yet on this day, the last bench had become an unintentional cradle for destiny. A young mother sat there, her posture a mixture of tension and fatigue. Her hair was pulled back hastily, a few strands escaping to frame her tired face. Her clothes were neat but plain, chosen less for fashion than for practicality. She had not come here to make a statement. She had come because she had no choice. Childcare had fallen through that morning, her sister called in sick, her neighbor unavailable, and with no one else to turn to. She had gathered her toddler in her arms and set out for the courthouse. The toddler was small for his age, with wide eyes that seemed to drink in the world around him. He clutched a plastic toy car in one hand, its paint chipped from hours of play, and fidgeted restlessly on his mother's lap. Now and then, he twisted sideways, peering over her arm to glimpse the sea of adults before him. To him, the courtroom wasn't a theater of justice. It was a place full of strange voices, heavy furniture, and bright lights that made everything look bigger than life did at first. Their presence drew little notice. Spectators, already restless, were too absorbed in the trial's details to care about a child in the back row. The attorneys didn't spare them a glance. The jurors had their eyes fixed on witnesses. Even the bailiff, tasked with keeping order, softened his stern gaze when he saw the boy nestled quietly against his mother. For a brief while, the toddler blended seamlessly into the background, a fleeting reminder of ordinary life in a room consumed by extraordinary conflict. The child was not passive. While adults strained to follow the tug-of-war between prosecution and defense, the toddler's gaze roamed with innocent intensity. His toy car rolled back and forth across his mother's knee, but his eyes lingered elsewhere, on the front of the courtroom, where the German shepherd sat leashed to its handler. The dog, with its proud frame and steady composure, fascinated him. He stared, his head tilted slightly, as though he recognized something familiar. The mother followed his gaze once, her brow furrowing briefly before she whispered in his ear, urging him to stay quiet. She thought his attention harmless, even endearing, unaware that it was more than mere curiosity. The boy leaned forward, eyes wide, lips parting as though words hovered just behind them. Then, distracted by the scraping of a chair as an attorney stood, he fell silent again. For now, the mother shifted uneasily. She knew the unspoken rules of a courtroom: silence, respect, stillness. Children, by their very nature, did not belong here. She feared her son's restlessness might draw unwanted attention, might embarrass her, or worse, disrupt the proceedings. She pressed a finger to his lips when he began to babble softly, shaking her head with a smile that was more plea than reprimand. Her own reasons for being there were personal, though not obvious. She was not directly tied to the trial, not a witness or defendant. She had come partly out of civic duty, partly out of curiosity, and partly because she believed that truth mattered, even when inconvenient. She had read about the case in the papers, seen the polarized opinions splashed across news feeds, and decided she wanted to hear for herself. History in the making, someone had said, and though she could not have articulated why, she felt compelled to be present. But now, sitting in the back row with her child, she questioned that choice. The trial dragged on, lawyers volleying arguments, the judge raising a hand now and then to maintain order. The mother adjusted her son's seat on her lap, whispering promises of snacks and playtime once this was over. He wriggled, then stilled, then wriggled again, as toddlers do, caught between boredom and bursts of sudden fascination. His fascination, however, never drifted far from the police dog, and the dog, almost imperceptibly, seemed to notice. Every so often, its amber eyes flicked toward the back row. To the handler, these shifts in attention meant little dogs scanned their surroundings naturally. But to anyone observant enough, there was something unusual in the way the canine's gaze lingered on the child, as though acknowledging him not merely as another face in the crowd, but as something familiar. The mother, uneasy now, rubbed her son's shoulder, trying to redirect his attention to the toy car. Sweetheart, she whispered. Almost done, but the boy was not interested in cars or promises of snacks. He pointed again, quietly this time, his finger small but insistent, his eyes locked on the dog. She lowered his hand quickly, glancing nervously toward the bailiff, hoping no one else had noticed. The last thing she wanted was to draw the ire of the court. Yet deep down, a knot of unease began to form in her stomach. Children were unpredictable, and hers bright, outspoken, unafraid of strangers, was especially so. If he decided to speak now, in this room heavy with formality, there would be no stopping him. The child babbled softly under his breath, a jumble of half-formed words, then grew quiet again, almost contemplative. His toy car slipped from his grasp and clattered to the floor, the sound sharp in the courtroom's tense silence. Heads turned briefly, the mother whispering frantic apologies as she bent to retrieve it. The judge's gavel tapped once, more a warning than punishment, and the proceedings resumed. The boy, unbothered by the stares, picked up where he left off watching the dog. His small chest rose and fell in quick breaths, his lips moving as though rehearsing something only he could hear. His mother stroked his hair, missing the determination growing in his gaze. For the rest of the courtroom, it was business as usual. Attorneys sparring, witnesses stumbling under pressure, jurors scribbling notes. But for the boy, everything narrowed to a single point, the presence of that animal at the front of the room. He didn't see the uniforms, the lawyers, or the weight of the trial. He saw only the dog. And somewhere deep inside him, a word waited, ready to break free. The mother shifted again, restless, adjusting the strap of her bag and bouncing her son slightly to keep him calm. She thought she was soothing him. She didn't realize she was stoking the rhythm of anticipation. Each bounce, each whispered hush, bringing him closer to the moment he would finally decide to speak. The courtroom had no idea. In the grand hall of justice, where every word was weighed, recorded, and dissected, no one expected significance to emerge from the babbling lips of a child. The adults believed they controlled the narrative, that truth would be uncovered through their arguments, their strategies, their authority. But truth has a way of choosing its own messengers. And in that back row, on his mother's lap, a toddler waited, eyes unblinking, finger twitching to point again, lips ready to form the word that would bring the courtroom to a standstill. The courtroom had reached one of those taut moments where every sound seemed amplified. The prosecution's attorney, tall and self-assured, paced deliberately across the floor, his polished shoes clicking like a metronome. He had cornered a witness, a nervous patrol officer who shifted uncomfortably under the harsh light of questioning. The attorney's voice grew louder, sharper, cutting through the silence like a knife. "Officer, are you saying under oath that your testimony today does not contradict the statement you gave 3 months ago?" The officer stammered, eyes darting toward the jury, then toward the defense attorney. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. The jury leaned forward, some with pens poised mid-air, waiting to capture the crack in his composure. The defense attorney, lips curved in a half-smile, sat ready to pounce. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Every ear strained for the officer's reply. The prosecutor's hand hovered in the air, waiting for emphasis. The judge shifted slightly, leaning forward on his elbows. It was the kind of silence where even the rustle of paper felt intrusive. And then, it happened. A high, clear voice rang out from the back of the room. Not the shaky tone of a nervous adult, not the booming authority of a lawyer, but the unfiltered sound of a child. "Doggy." The single word shot through the chamber like a gunshot. The officer froze mid-sentence. The prosecutor blinked, startled, his rhythm broken. The judge's gavel, which had been poised idly beside him, clattered slightly as he shifted in surprise. All heads turned, almost in unison, toward the source. On the back bench, the young mother sat frozen, cheeks flushing crimson, as her toddler stretched out one tiny arm, finger extended straight toward the German shepherd at the front of the courtroom. The boy's eyes shone with recognition, his face lit with the joy of discovery. To him, it was the most natural declaration in the world. To the courtroom, it was an earthquake. "Sweetheart," the mother whispered desperately, pulling at his hand. Not now. But the boy wasn't done. The first exclamation had broken the dam of silence. And now words spilled from his lips with startling clarity. He pointed more firmly, voice ringing with certainty. Rex. A name hung in the air. It wasn't a guess. It wasn't a playful nickname. It was precise, deliberate, and chillingly correct. The operational command name of the K-9, a detail guarded closely within the police unit and never disclosed publicly. For a moment, time itself seemed to halt. The jurors stared, wide-eyed. The defense attorney's pen rolled slowly off his table and clattered to the floor. Forgotten. The prosecutor's composure faltered, his jaw hanging open before he snapped it shut. The judge's brows knitted together, his gaze sharp, heavy, as he tried to process what he had just heard. The handler stiffened, knuckles whitening around the leash. The dog responded immediately, ears pricking, body rising ever so slightly, recognizing its name spoken with uncanny accuracy. A low whine escaped its throat, not threatening but alert, as though waiting for the next command. The courtroom erupted in a wave of whispers. Did he just... Wait, did that kid say? No one's supposed to know the dog's name. The bailiff barked, order, slamming a heavy hand against the nearest bench, but his command barely penetrated the shocked murmurs. Reporters scribbled frantically, some already fumbling for phones they weren't supposed to use. The jury exchanged uneasy glances, their carefully constructed impartiality rattled by the innocent voice of a child. The mother hugged her son tightly, whispering frantic apologies. He's just a baby, Your Honor. Please, he doesn't know what he's saying. But the damage was done. The defense attorney was the first to recover. Slowly, deliberately, he rose to his feet, smoothing his tie with a measured hand. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but heavy with implication. Your Honor, with all due respect, I think we all heard the same thing. The judge's gavel struck the block sharply. Order. I will have order in this courtroom. The noise subsided slightly, but the undercurrent of shock remained, buzzing like electricity through the chamber. The handler finally spoke, his voice low, defensive. It's just coincidence. Kids repeat words, Your Honor. Maybe he overheard something, but the explanation rang hollow. Everyone in the room knew the truth. The K-9's operational name was classified, used only within the unit, and never spoken publicly. To hear it from a toddler was not coincidence, it was a revelation. The prosecutor scrambled to regain footing, but his once commanding presence seemed shaken. This is irrelevant, he argued, though his voice cracked slightly. We cannot allow the testimony of a child, barely able to speak, to derail the proceedings. The defense pounced. Irrelevant? Or inconvenient? Because what we've just witnessed raises questions about who really knows what in this courtroom. The jury shifted again, their attention no longer on the nervous patrol officer, but on the boy in the back row. What had begun as a sharp interrogation had been derailed by innocence itself, and the atmosphere was forever changed. The dog sat, steady but alert, as though sensing the shift in power. The handler avoided eye contact with anyone, his jaw tight, sweat beginning to bead at his temple. The mother rocked her son gently, trying to hush him, but he looked at her with bright eyes, proud of the word he had spoken, unaware of its weight. The silence that followed was no longer ordinary. It was heavy, filled with suspicion, curiosity, and a dawning sense that the trial had just turned down a road no one had expected. And at the heart of it all, a toddler sat quietly in his mother's arms, blissfully unaware that his innocent voice had cracked open a door everyone else had worked so hard to keep shut. The silence that followed was unlike anything the courtroom had experienced before. It was not the silence of order, not the silence of a judge's gavel, nor the hush that fell before a key testimony. It was raw, unfiltered shock, a kind of stillness that seemed to bend time itself. The toddler's voice, small and clear, still hung in the minds of every person present. Rex. The name vibrated in the air, echoing long after the sound itself had faded. No one moved. No one breathed too deeply. It was as if the entire room was waiting for someone else to act first, to explain the impossible dot at the front of the room. The German shepherd reacted with unmistakable recognition. His ears shot up, his muscles stiffened, and his amber eyes fixed on the boy in the back. He had been trained to respond to that name, above all else, not to bark, not to charge, but to lock his attention on the one who spoke it. And he did, unwavering and alert. The handler felt the shift immediately. His hand tightened on the leash, his pulse quickening. He had worked with this animal for years. He knew the signals. The dog wasn't just hearing a random word, it was responding to command, to familiarity. The handler's throat tightened as he glanced quickly around, avoiding the eyes that bore into him. He prayed silently that anyone would dismiss it as coincidence, but no one was dismissing anything. The jury was transfixed, their notebooks abandoned. Some leaned forward, brows furrowed, eyes flicking between the child and the dog. One juror covered her mouth with a trembling hand. Another exchanged a wide-eyed glance with the man seated beside her. Their expressions said what none dared to speak aloud. How could the boy possibly know? The defense attorney broke the stillness first. He rose slowly, deliberately, like a predator sensing weakness. He didn't speak yet. He let the silence stretch, let the weight of the child's words sink into the bones of every juror. Then he turned to the judge, voice measured, but carrying an edge of triumph. "Your Honor," he said. The child spoke the operational name of the K-9. That is not a coincidence. The prosecutor shot to his feet. "Objection. This is absurd." But his voice cracked, betraying his own disbelief. The judge raised a hand, silencing both. His gaze moved to the handler. "Is that, in fact, the dog's operational name?" The handler hesitated, his mouth dry. He wanted to deny it, to dismiss it, but lying under oath would destroy him, perhaps even more than the truth. Finally, with visible reluctance, he gave a stiff nod. "Yes, Your Honor. That is the dog's name." A collective gasp rippled across the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching like claws against paper. The jury sat back, some shaking their heads, some whispering despite themselves. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression darkening. "Then the question becomes," he said slowly, "how a child too young to be a part of these proceedings could possibly know such information." The defense attorney seized the moment. "Exactly, Your Honor. The name was supposed to be classified. The fact that it surfaced here, in this courtroom, from the mouth of a toddler, suggests leaks, mishandling of protocol, or worse, deliberate concealment of evidence." The prosecutor's face flushed. He pounded the table with his palm. "This is ridiculous. He's a child. Children repeat words, mimic sounds. It means nothing. Nothing?" The defense attorney shot back. His voice sharpened, rising with intensity. "A child too young to tie his own shoes just spoke a word that is restricted information. You can call it nothing, but the jury heard it. The court heard it. The dog himself responded to it." All eyes flicked back to the German shepherd. He was still staring at the child, ears perked, muscles tense. The dog's body language was a silent testimony, one no lawyer could refute. The mother clutched her son tightly, whispering frantically, "Sweetheart, please, no more. Please be quiet." Her face was crimson, a mixture of embarrassment and fear. She looked toward the judge, tears pricking her eyes. "He's just a baby, Your Honor. He doesn't understand what he's saying." The boy wriggled against her hold, determined to point again, his lips parting as if ready to repeat the forbidden name. She covered his mouth with her hand, rocking him gently, desperate to undo what had already been done. The bailiff shifted uneasily, stepping forward, uncertain whether to intervene. His eyes flicked toward the judge, waiting for an order. But the judge gave none. He was lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the dog, the handler, and then the boy, his mind racing through implications no one had expected to face today. The silence returned, heavier than before. No one trusted their own voice, afraid of breaking the fragile stillness. It was the silence of realization, of understanding that something deeply unsettling had slipped into the open. The handler finally spoke, his voice low, defensive. Maybe the child heard it somewhere. On the street. From someone in the unit. Kids pick things up. The defense attorney cut him off sharply. From someone in the unit? Then you admit the possibility of careless handling of classified information? The handler's jaw clenched. He had walked straight into the trap. The prosecutor interjected, his tone desperate now. This line of questioning is irrelevant. The case at hand concerns allegations of misconduct in a specific incident, not the operational name of a dog. But the jury wasn't listening to him anymore. Their eyes were on the child, on the handler, on the animal that sat so still, yet spoke volumes with its posture. The prosecutor's words bounced off deaf ears. The balance of the room had shifted. The defense attorney's smile was thin, dangerous. He could feel its control slipping from the prosecution's grip, sliding firmly into his own hands. All thanks to a boy who couldn't even spell his own name. The judge tapped his gavel once, not to silence, but to steady. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed unease. This matter will not be dismissed lightly. For now, we will proceed. But let it be clear, the court cannot ignore what has just occurred. The prosecutor sat down heavily, frustration etched across his face. The defense attorney remained standing a moment longer, savoring the silence, then returned to his seat with quiet confidence. The mother, rocking her child, whispered prayers only she could hear. The boy rested against her shoulder, his small hand still outstretched toward the dog, and the dog did not look away. In that moment, it was no longer a courtroom, governed by words and evidence alone. It had become something stranger, something rawer, a place where innocence had pierced through secrecy, where silence spoke louder than arguments, and where truth, uninvited, had walked in on the lips of a child. The silence finally broke, replaced by the scratch of pens, the shuffle of papers, and the hollow echo of shoes on polished floors. But no one forgot the word that had shattered it. Rex. A name. A secret. A spark that promised the trial would never be the same again. The air in the courtroom felt heavier than before, as if the very walls had absorbed the shock of what had just happened. People sat rigid, some still whispering, others frozen with pens poised above paper, their notes abandoned mid-sentence. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed louder, filling the void left by voices that had fallen silent. Everyone was waiting for explanation, for denial, for something to make sense of the impossible. The judge, his face grave, leaned forward in his chair. His eyes, sharp and unblinking, settled on the handler. "Officer," he said, his voice slow but carrying undeniable weight, "confirm for this court, is the name the child spoke in fact the operational identifier of this canine?" The handler shifted in his seat. Sweat dotted his brow, and his fingers twitched against the leash. He opened his mouth, closed it, then swallowed hard. He had hoped, prayed even, that the storm would blow past, that everyone would dismiss the child's utterance as nonsense. But there was no escaping the truth. The dog had responded. Everyone had seen it. "Yes, Your Honor," he admitted at last, his voice strained. "That is the dog's operational name." The words fell like a stone into water, sending ripples of unease across the courtroom. Gasps filled the air, followed by a swell of murmurs. The jury, now leaning forward, scribbled furiously, their once drowsy expressions replaced by sharp attentiveness. Spectators shifted in their seats, craning to see better. Reporters' pens scratched like frantic insects, capturing every syllable. The defense attorney pounced. He stood, his movements deliberate, like a man who had been waiting for this very moment. His voice was calm, but carried a razor's edge. Your Honor, this revelation cannot be dismissed. The child is far too young to have learned such information casually. That name is classified guarded by protocol. If it has slipped beyond the confines of law enforcement, we must ask, how? And more importantly, why? The prosecutor sprang to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This line of reasoning is speculative and irrelevant to the charges before us. But his tone betrayed desperation. His usual confidence had cracked, and everyone could hear it. The judge raised a hand, silencing both. Objection noted. However, he said firmly, the defense raises a fair concern. The court must understand how this information could have reached a child so young. All eyes turned to the handler again. His throat worked as he struggled for words. I don't know, Your Honor. Perhaps the name was overheard. Maybe one of the unit members slipped in casual conversation. Children pick things up, they repeat words, phrases. The defense attorney struck like lightning. So you admit the possibility that classified information was mishandled by your unit? That it was spoken outside the confines of secure protocol? The handler's eyes widened. That's not what I... Answer the question, officer. A hush fell again. The handler clenched his jaw. To deny would be to lie, and lies under oath carried consequences. But to admit was to throw his own unit under suspicion. Either way, the defense had him cornered. Yes, he said at last, his voice quiet. It's possible. The defense attorney let the word hang in the air like smoke. He didn't need to embellish. The jury could do the work themselves. The prosecutor scrambled to recover. Your Honor, I must emphasize the operational name of a K-9 is not material evidence in this case. We are here to discuss alleged misconduct, not to speculate on security lapses. But the defense was relentless. On the contrary, Your Honor, the credibility of this unit, and by extension the officers involved, lies at the very heart of this case. If they cannot protect something as basic as a dog's identifier, how can we trust them to uphold integrity in the far more serious matters before this court? The jury's expressions told the story. Doubt had taken root. The mother, in the back row, clutched her son tighter, her face pale. She had tried to quiet him, tried to stop the words from escaping his lips, but the damage was irreversible. Her son had set something in motion she could neither control nor undo. She rocked him gently, whispering soothing nonsense, but her eyes darted anxiously toward the jurors, toward the judge, toward the defense attorney, whose words now wielded the weight of inevitability. The child, oblivious to the storm he had unleashed, rested his head against her shoulder, a small smile tugging at his lips. His gaze lingered on the dog, who remained fixated on him, ears still pricked, body taut with recognition. The judge rubbed his temple, clearly unsettled. He had presided over hundreds of cases, heard lies, truths, and half-truths from witnesses of every background imaginable. But never had he been forced to confront the testimony of a child too young to understand the gravity of his own words. He leaned forward again. Officer, one more question. Is it standard practice to disclose this dog's operational name outside of official use? No, Your Honor, the handler said, his voice hoarse. It's strictly restricted. The judge nodded, his expression grim. Then the fact that it was spoken here by a toddler suggests a breach. Whether accidental or deliberate remains to be determined. Either way, the implications are serious. The prosecutor's face darkened. He knew the damage was irreversible. He could argue irrelevance all day, but the seed of doubt had been planted in the jury's mind, and doubt was poison to his case. The defense attorney, sensing victory, pressed further. Your Honor, I will submit a motion that this revelation be entered into the record. It speaks directly to the issue of credibility, of transparency, and of whether the unit, and by extension, the prosecution's witnesses, have been forthright with this court. Motion granted, the judge said heavily. The words hit like a gavel themselves. The courtroom erupted once again into murmurs, some voices hushed, others brazen. The bailiff barked for order, pounding the bench with his hand, but it took long moments before the room quieted again. The mother sat in stunned silence, her child still wriggling in her arms as though eager to speak again. She covered his mouth with trembling fingers, whispering desperate pleas for quiet. The dog let out a low, almost mournful whine, still staring unblinking at the boy. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, satisfied. The prosecutor scribbled furiously on his notepad, his jaw tight. A handler sat rigid, humiliated, the leash pulled so taut his knuckles blanched. And above them all, the judge sat with furrowed brow, weighing the revelation that had just tipped the balance of the trial. The word had been small, innocent, spoken by a child too young to understand. But its impact was seismic. A courtroom built on arguments and evidence had just been shaken by something no one had anticipated. Truth from the mouth of a toddler. And the revelation was only the beginning. The revelation lingered in the air, like smoke after a gunshot, visible, suffocating, impossible to ignore. It had been only a word, a name, spoken by lips too small to form entire sentences with clarity, yet its ripple spread outward, touching every corner of the courtroom. The judge's gavel had restored order in form, but not in spirit. The people sitting in the gallery leaned in close to whisper feverishly. The jury, once passive observers, now appeared almost energized, their pens scratching with renewed urgency, their eyes flicking between the handler, the defense attorney, and the child. Even the bailiff, whose job was to appear unmoved, shifted uneasily, the stern mask of neutrality cracking at the edges. The prosecutor knew the room was slipping from his control. He had seen it before, the exact moment when confidence in a case frayed, when the jury stopped nodding along and instead began asking silent questions of their own. It was a death knell that no amount of eloquence could completely undo. Still, he could not surrender ground. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Your Honor," he said, his voice pitched louder than usual, as if sheer volume could drown out doubt, "we are allowing theatrics to eclipse substance. This case is not about a dog's name. It is about an incident of alleged misconduct. The defense would love to distract us, to lure us into chasing shadows. But shadows do not make evidence." His words carried force, but not conviction. He sounded like a man fighting the tide. The defense attorney rose with leisurely calm, a contrast that only emphasized his growing advantage. He adjusted his tie, then addressed the court as though he were lecturing a class of eager students. "With respect, Your Honor, shadows matter when they reveal what the light has been hiding. The prosecution wants you to believe this child's words are meaningless. But what do we know? That the name spoken is classified. That the dog responded to it unmistakably. That the handler admitted breaches are possible." He turned, letting his gaze sweep over the jury. "These are not shadows. These are cracks in the wall of credibility. And once cracks appear, it is only a matter of time before the entire structure collapses." Murmurs spread again. The judge's gavel cracked once more, but the damage was done. Seeds of doubt had not only been planted, they were germinating. At the back of the room, the mother held her son tighter, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the eyes of strangers crawling over her, some sympathetic, others accusatory. Her son, oblivious, giggled softly as he reached again toward the dog, as if calling a friend. She hushed him quickly, but the sound was enough to draw every gaze back for another moment of unbearable tension. The handler tugged the leash, trying to redirect the canine's attention, but the dog refused to break its stare from the boy. A low whine slipped from its throat, subtle but audible in the hushed chamber. The sound cut through the arguments of lawyers like a blade, a reminder that not everything could be explained away with rhetoric. The judge, unsettled, leaned back in his chair. His fingers tapped against the wood of the bench, betraying his restlessness. He had seen cases derailed by procedural errors, by mishandled evidence, by reckless testimony. But to watch a trial wobble on the innocent utterance of a child, it was almost surreal. Yet the weight of the moment was undeniable. The prosecutor pressed on, sensing the court's faith slipping like sand through his fingers. He approached the handler with renewed determination. "Officer, answer plainly. Is there any conceivable way this child could have known the operational name without overhearing it from someone careless? Any legitimate way?" The handler hesitated, glancing at the boy, then at the jury. His silence was damning. "Answer," the prosecutor barked. The handler swallowed. "No, sir. Not legitimately." The words landed like blows. The jury's pens moved faster, heads nodding almost imperceptibly. The defense attorney smiled faintly. He didn't even need to press this time. The prosecution had boxed itself in. Every attempt to dismiss the matter only made it appear more significant. "Your Honor," the defense said smoothly, "what we have just heard is an admission that breaches have occurred. If breaches exist, then the possibility of misconduct in larger matters cannot be dismissed. This is no longer speculation. This is fact." The prosecutor slammed his palm on the table. "This is a circus." But the outburst worked against him. The jury recoiled, eyes narrowing. He looked desperate, unhinged, while the defense appeared composed, in control. The judge's gavel cracked down harder this time. "Enough!" His voice carried authority, but his expression betrayed unease. "The court recognizes that this revelation has bearing on the credibility of key witnesses and the integrity of procedure. We will not pretend it does not exist. From this moment forward, the operational handling of this K-9 unit will be examined in connection to this case." The prosecutor slumped, shoulders heavy. The defense allowed himself a small breath of satisfaction. The gallery buzzed with speculation. Some whispered theories about corruption, others about cover-ups, and still others about the uncanny connection between the child and the dog. Reporters scribbled furiously, already drafting headlines that would capture the drama of the day. In the corner, the mother closed her eyes, her arms tightening around her son. She wanted nothing more than to vanish, to escape the suffocating spotlight her child had unknowingly pulled them into. She whispered again in his ear, pleading softly, "Please, no more words. Please, baby." But the boy only giggled, his hand stretching out once more toward the German shepherd, who remained transfixed, loyal not to the handler at his side, but to the toddler across the room. The chain reaction had begun, unstoppable now. A child's voice had cracked open a secret, and from that crack, truths messy, dangerous, undeniable, were already seeping into the light. And everyone in the room knew. Nothing about this trial would ever be simple again. The courtroom had changed. It was no longer a simple chamber of law, evidence, and procedure. The air itself seemed charged, a current running through the wooden panels, bouncing off the high ceilings, and threading through the gallery of spectators. Whispers crawled like vines across benches, around the jury, into the ears of reporters, frantically scribbling notes. Witnesses who had once been confident, almost assured in their testimony, now shifted uncomfortably under the collective gaze of the room. Their statements, previously polished and rehearsed, began to show cracks, small but glaring, that no attorney could have anticipated. The defense attorney sensed it immediately, The case, once tight in the prosecution's grasp, was beginning to slip. The judge tapped his gavel to regain order, but even his authority felt diminished. "All witnesses," he said, voice measured but heavy with warning, "you will remain seated. Any new statements or clarifications will be conducted under oath." In full view of this court, the first witness to be recalled was Officer Daniels, a young patrolman who had been central to the prosecution's narrative. He rose slowly, adjusting his uniform, as though the very weight of the courtroom's tension pressed down on his shoulders. The defense attorney approached deliberately, steps echoing in the silence. "Officer Daniels," the attorney began, voice calm but slicing, "you testified earlier that all protocol was followed during the incident in question. Yet today, we have learned a classified operational name has somehow been spoken in this courtroom by a child. How can you reconcile that?" Daniels blinked rapidly. Do not speculate," the judge interjected. "Answer the question to the best of your knowledge." The officer swallowed hard, voice trembling. "Protocols are followed, normally, but there are occasional lapses. It's possible someone, somewhere, spoke the name. I wasn't present." The defense attorney leaned forward, letting the silence stretch. "You weren't present, meaning you cannot guarantee the integrity of these procedures at all times?" Daniels hesitated. "Correct." A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom. Where there had been certainty, now there was ambiguity. Where there had been confidence, now there was doubt. The defense had begun its work in earnest. The next witness was Lieutenant Carr, a senior officer who had overseen multiple operations involving the K-9 unit. He took the stand with measured composure, but the faint tremor in his hand betrayed a growing unease. "Lieutenant," the defense began, "are you aware of any instances where operational protocol regarding classified identifiers may have been compromised?" Carr's eyes flicked toward the K-9 at the front of the room. The dog remained unnervingly alert, as if aware of its central role in this unfolding drama. I cannot say definitively," Carr admitted. "There have been minor breaches in the past. Nothing that caused harm, but breaches nonetheless." The attorney's gaze swept the courtroom. "Minor breaches," he repeated, slow and deliberate. "Then it is possible, is it not, that the child in the back row may have overheard such a breach, intentionally or otherwise?" Carr hesitated again, and the jury leaned forward. The room felt taut, the tension almost physical. Every murmur, every scratch of pen against paper, every rustle of clothing was magnified in the charged silence. "Objection!" The prosecutor's voice rang, too sharp, too loud. "This is conjecture. There is no evidence the child did anything beyond repeat a word he may have overheard." The defense attorney shot back, his voice unwavering. "And yet that word, Your Honor, is classified. Its presence here cannot be dismissed lightly. Its source is relevant to the credibility of those responsible for safeguarding it." The judge leaned back, tapping the gavel. Sustained, but tempered. "The court acknowledges the line of questioning must focus on potential breaches without speculation. Continue carefully." Even with the judge's admonition, the seed of doubt had been planted. Witnesses who had once stood with authority now faltered under scrutiny. Each answer they gave was scrutinized, measured, and weighed against the chilling reminder of what had just occurred. A toddler had spoken a word meant to remain secret. The prosecution scrambled, calling back Officer Green, a handler who had worked alongside the K-9 in prior operations. Green had been confident, meticulous, and detailed in prior testimony. But when asked about security measures and the handling of classified identifiers, his composure faltered. We take precautions," he said slowly. "But lapses can happen. I can't guarantee." "Can't guarantee what, officer?" The defense pressed, voice cutting. That information remains contained? That procedures are followed consistently? That the canine's operational name was never spoken inappropriately? The courtroom absorbed the weight of his words. Every juror, every observer, every attorney recognized the significance. The prosecution's narrative of professionalism, of ironclad procedure, was beginning to crumble. Even outside the legal arguments, the human element had taken center stage. Spectators whispered about how strange it was, how unsettling it felt, that a child so young, so untrained, had caused this upheaval. The mother's face was pale, beads of sweat forming at her temples. Her son, still nestled in her lap, reached toward the dog again, oblivious to the magnitude of his unintentional testimony. The canine's posture remained rigid, alert, almost expectant. The handler's knuckles widened on the leash as he tried to maintain the illusion of control. But no one could deny the subtle, powerful tension. The dog's recognition of the child, the acknowledgement of authority, the silent confirmation of what had just been said. The defense attorney, sensing the unraveling, moved to strike again. "Lieutenant Carr," he said, "based on your admissions and the testimony of other officers, would you agree that protocol has not been consistently followed? That breaches, however minor, have occurred repeatedly?" Carr hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, there have been repeated breaches." The courtroom reacted instantly. Some gasped audibly. Others whispered, shaking their heads in disbelief. The prosecution's team huddled together briefly, eyes darting nervously, papers rustling in frantic consultation. They were scrambling, trying to regain control, but the momentum had shifted irreversibly. The judge raised his hand, demanding calm. "Order. We will proceed, but the court recognizes the gravity of these revelations. Witnesses will answer truthfully. The integrity of procedure is under review, and any further lapses will be noted in the official record." For the remainder of the morning, witnesses were recalled one by one. Each new testimony revealed inconsistencies, minor contradictions, and troubling admissions. What had once been a straightforward case about alleged misconduct was now evolving into an examination of systemic vulnerability, fueled by the seemingly innocent utterance of a child in the back row. By midday, the atmosphere had transformed entirely. The courtroom, once a place of routine procedure and formal rhetoric, had become a theater of uncertainty. Every person present felt the weight of suspicion. The prosecution was on edge, the defense emboldened, the jury captivated. Even the gallery leaned forward, drawn into the drama of revelations that no one could have predicted. And through it all, the child sat quietly, nestled in his mother's arms, fingers occasionally reaching out toward the German shepherd, who remained unwavering, alert, and watchful. The ripple of impact extended beyond the courtroom. A word, a name, a momentary lapse in secrecy had exposed cracks in the system that no argument or motion could fully contain. And while the attorneys debated, and the judge weighed the implications, one fact was undeniable. The courtroom had changed. Nothing would be the same. The unraveling was not complete, but it had begun. Every witness, every statement, every carefully constructed defense now carried the shadow of doubt. The canine, the child, and the revelation of a secret name had all combined to fracture the illusion of certainty. And everyone, lawyers, jurors, spectators, even the judge knew the trial was entering a new precarious chapter. The courtroom never quite returned to its previous rhythm. Even after witnesses were excused and attorneys returned to their tables, the tension lingered like a heavy fog, thick and pervasive. The word Rex still hovered in the air, a small utterance that had upended everything. The judge leaned back, rubbing his temples. His gavel rested in his hand, a futile reminder of control. He had presided over hundreds of trials, some messy, some tragic, some riddled with deceit. But nothing compared to this, a case derailed by the innocent voice of a toddler, A single syllable that exposed vulnerabilities, inconsistencies, and hidden truths. The jury, once orderly and attentive, now sat in a collective state of disbelief. Their notes were thorough, but peppered with question marks, arrows, and notes to themselves. The deliberation they would face was no longer about the specifics of the original incident alone. It had expanded to include the credibility of the witnesses, the reliability of the officers, and the integrity of the protocols. Every word spoken during testimony now seemed filtered through the lens of doubt. The defense attorney, sensing that the tide had turned decisively, sat back with a subtle but victorious smile. His strategy had relied on facts, observation, and the unexpected catalyst that was the toddler. What had begun as a conventional case had transformed into a dramatic exposure of weakness within the prosecution's ranks. And he had guided it carefully, without uttering a single accusatory word about the child or the dog. The prosecution, however, was visibly shaking. Papers shuffled nervously across the table. Pens scratched frantically across notebooks as lawyers muttered to one another. Their earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a dawning recognition that the courtroom's perception had shifted irreversibly. Their narrative, carefully constructed and rehearsed, was unraveling thread by thread. In the gallery, spectators whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others exchanged glances that bordered on fear, as if witnessing a fracture in authority itself. One reporter muttered to a colleague, "I've never seen anything like this." A child, a dog, and a courtroom hanging on a single word. The mother, still holding her son tightly, felt a mixture of relief, anxiety, and awe. She had tried desperately to silence him, fearful of the chaos he might inadvertently cause. And yet now she realized that her child's innocent curiosity had sparked something larger than anyone had anticipated. He had spoken truth, pure and unfiltered, without comprehension of its implications. And the courtroom had listened. The toddler, unaware of the seismic shift he had created, finally relaxed against his mother's shoulder. His fingers brushed the dog's leash, and the German shepherd's eyes softened ever so slightly, acknowledging him not as a threat, but as an ally. The small gesture, invisible to most of the courtroom, carried a quiet weight of resolution. The dog recognized the child as something extraordinary, a link between innocence and revelation. The judge cleared his throat, his voice measured but tinged with weariness. Given the developments of today, the court will review procedures, testimonies, and the handling of sensitive information within the K-9 unit. Any findings will be documented and factored into deliberations. We will adjourn for the day and reconvene after the jury has had time to deliberate the implications of these revelations. A murmur rippled through the room, but it was subdued compared to the chaos of earlier. Everyone understood the gravity. This trial was no longer just about the alleged incident. It was about trust, protocol, and the fragile boundary between oversight and exposure. The prosecution packed their notes and files with methodical urgency, each lawyer glancing repeatedly toward the gallery, toward the boy, toward the dog. They were still trying to recalibrate their strategy, to regain control over a courtroom that now seemed impossibly unpredictable. The defense attorney, on the other hand, gathered his materials with deliberate calm. He understood the moment had passed beyond traditional argument. The narrative had been reshaped, and it now played in his favor. All that remained was for the jury to reconcile what they had seen, heard, and now understood. Outside the formalities, the gallery buzzed with speculation. Spectators whispered about the uncanny intelligence of the K-9, about the toddler's inexplicable recognition, about what the word Rex meant in terms of trust, secrecy, and oversight. Some wondered aloud if the child had an instinct, a natural ability to perceive the unseen, while others chalked it up to coincidence. But no one could deny the courtroom had witnessed something rare. Almost unreal, a perfect convergence of innocence, instinct, and revelation. The mother finally stood, cradling her son as she stepped toward the exit. She kept her gaze low, aware of the attention that followed her. She felt both pride and apprehension. Pride that her child had spoken truth without malice, and apprehension at the realization that even innocence could ignite upheaval. The canine handler finally exhaled, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the day. He untangled the leash and allowed the dog to sit at his side, still alert but calmer now. He knew the court would examine every action, every procedure, and every oversight in the coming days. The quiet acknowledgement in the dog's amber eyes seemed to convey understanding this day. This courtroom had changed them all. Outside, reporters crowded in clusters, capturing the reactions of spectators, attorneys, and law enforcement. Cameras flashed, microphones hovered, and voices buzzed. The story would spread far beyond the courthouse walls. A tale of innocence disrupting authority, of a toddler's simple utterance exposing cracks in a seemingly impregnable system. The child, now relaxed in his mother's arms, yawned and rubbed his eyes. He had no awareness of the extraordinary role he had played. For him, it had been a day of curiosity, of seeing a large dog, of pointing and naming what he found familiar. Yet unknowingly, he had shifted the balance of power in a courtroom, had forced adults to confront vulnerabilities they had long ignored, and had reminded everyone present that truth often arrives in the smallest forms. As the crowd dispersed, the judge remained at his bench, staring down at the papers before him. He reflected on the fragility of authority, the unpredictability of testimony, and the strange power of innocence. The courtroom had been stunned. Yes, but it had also been reminded of something deeper, that sometimes the most profound truths arrive from the most unexpected voices. The dog, now resting quietly beside its handler, seemed to sense the shift. Its posture relaxed slightly, its gaze occasionally flicking toward the boy in the back row. A silent bond lingered between them, unspoken yet unmistakable, a reminder that instinct, loyalty, and recognition could transcend words, even in the most formal of settings. In the aftermath, the courtroom itself felt different. The polished floor seemed colder, the walls taller, the air thicker. Every witness who had testified, every attorney who had argued, every juror who had scribbled notes would carry the memory of that single, shattering word, Rex, and though the trial would continue, though the deliberations would stretch on, and the verdict would eventually be rendered, the moment when a toddler's voice had disrupted authority, unmasked oversight failures, and forced everyone to reckon with an unreal revelation, would remain etched in the collective memory of all present. Outside the courthouse, the world would read about the event with incredulity, disbelief, and fascination. Headlines would dramatize, pundits would speculate, and yet no report could fully capture the raw, almost mystical sequence of events. A child, a dog, a secret revealed, and a courtroom left stunned in its wake. The mother finally stepped out into the sunlight, her child asleep in her arms. She breathed deeply, the chaos behind her fading into echoes. She knew, even if the world did not, that something extraordinary had occurred that day, a story that would be recounted, remembered, and perhaps even mythologized. The toddler had returned the truth to those who thought they controlled it. And in that unreal moment, everyone, lawyers, officers, jurors, spectators, had been reminded that sometimes innocence holds more power than authority ever could.